morning. I appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about Ebola and our response to it. And I was going to bring in this book I have in my office for bug nerds like me, but it's a whole book on plagues that have changed the world. And if anyone wants to read it, I have it. It's fascinating. But as I was flipping through it the other night, realized that even though we haven't and most likely won't have a true pandemic of Ebola, this outbreak has changed how we think, right? How we respond to potential, especially Class A bugs. So what I'd like to do today is to look at how it has affected us today and where we think we're going to go in the future. First of all, those of you who know me love the epidemiology books, and I'm a laboratorian by trade, so I might get a little technical at times, but I took my infection control training first time in the late 80s at CDC. And at that time, Ebola was the scariest thing on the face of the earth, because they were just starting to figure out what was going on with it. And it still has that analogy in the bug world because of the seriousness of the death. It's a bad death. It's a bloody, icky death. And so it has always been listed as one of the highest concerns. But it was first discovered in '76. And ironically, even that discovery is not unusual today. Here was a young scientist, 27-year-old, working in Belgium, and he got a shiny blue thermos, for those of you around in 1976, with the glass inset, from a pilot who had gotten it from a bush community in Zaire. And there a nun was dying, and they had brought some of her blood for them to look at. And they thought it was yellow fever, and so they asked him to investigate. And he looked at yellow fever and Marburg fever and a bunch of other bugs. But he remembers to this day, I just saw an interview with him, when he opened up that blue container, the glass inset had shattered, and so there was all kinds of glass inside. And he remembered thinking, this ain't good, okay? They, obviously it didn't grow out in any of their cultures, and so they injected it in mice. And he said nothing happened until 4 or 5 days, then all of a sudden they all died. And then they realized they had something serious. So they later identified it, called it Ebola, because they had a little map in their Belgium office of Africa, and it looked like Ebola was the closest river, which they found out later there's lots of other rivers in between, but they kind of like the name Ebola, so they named it Ebola. But what was interesting with this first outbreak of Ebola was that it was a nun a group of nuns working in a hospital in Zaire, and they were giving vitamins by injection to pregnant women and not cleaning the needles properly. And the first outbreak of Ebola started with dirty needles. We're still talking about aseptic tank in managing meds, aren't we? So things from that perspective have not changed much. Come on in. So anyway, that was the first, and he was involved with the team. Right now, he is still working in the tropical department in London, working with bugs. Okay, Ebola this is all the technical stuff us med techs like with Ebola, but I just want you to realize that it's not by itself in the world. If you look at all the Filoviridae, there are a bunch of them, including Marburg and Lassa fever, and they've all been around even longer than Ebola. But if you look at the types of Ebola, there's 4 of them. One of them, the last one, the Reston one, was actually identified here in the U.S., in Reston, Pennsylvania. but it does not affect humans. But the other three are human-borne. And the one we're working with today is the Zaire strain. And if you look at the outbreaks of the Zaire strain of Ebola, they happen about every 2-3 years in small communities and small areas of the world. And the bigger the, I know this is blurry and I apologize, I copied it off of CDC, but the bigger reds are the Zaire ones. And as you can see, over the years, there's the ones have primarily stayed in West Africa. And then the green are another strain that have caused serious outbreaks just in 2000 and 2004. So we're still dealing with little bits and pieces of it. Now, what happened with this one? Why is this one different? Even though we've been seeing these on and off for years, is because of the same thing that we're dealing with in the US. People are traveling, they're moving more, and the bug got into the big cities. And once it did that, it was a challenge with their culture to keep it contained. As of October 25th, this outbreak now has over 10,000 people have been exposed and almost 5,000 have died. And as you can see, the majority of them have been in Liberia and Sierra Leone, but we just had our first case in Mali that's starting to identify.
What makes it occasionally decide to be, if we want to call it dormant, and then all of a sudden then it percolates and breaks out again?
It never goes dormant.
I know, I'm just using that
Yeah,
as a,
yeah.
because, you know, we just don't have the big outbreaks, and then all of a sudden then we get, because I know, what was it, 5 years ago or whatever, when they had the big outbreak, and then it kind of went away, and now we're doing it again, so.
What happened was they were able to contain it. If there's no people-to-people exposure, they can stop it. And if it's in a small village, they've basically done quarantine, or they end up with herd immunity, where most of the people either died or now they have developed immunity. But now, because it's gone to the big city, is where it's gone crazy. And now we're traveling back and forth. So one of the issues that they're nervous about now is, where's it going to go next into an outbreak setting? Again, the bigger the yellow, the more people have been ill. Here's Liberia down here, here's Sierra Leone, and then around the top is Guinea. And if you notice, up on top is Mali. And they've had their first case in Mali. One of the things they're most concerned about now is not Europe and America. They're concerned about India, because a lot of Indians work in West Africa. There's a lot of jobs there for them. And they're concerned about them being exposed and go to India, where the population, as you know, is humongous, and cultures are similar, and they have a lot of time with healthcare there. So the biggest concern now is, as you hear over and over on television, is to keep it here. Keep it here. The way it is growing right now, they expect at least, the statisticians are guesstimating, that we'll see at least one person entering the U.S. a week with Ebola. At least one. Okay, with the numbers, and as the numbers grow and if they get bigger and bigger, we're going to see more and more. So we're dealing with, how do we contain it in South Africa? How can we make a difference there? One of the areas that we see the biggest concern with is in healthcare workers. And with the data that we have available now, you can see we've had over 452 exposed and over 240 have died from it. Now, most of these have died in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We did have the one nurse in Spain who, no, she lived. She was exposed to in Spain, but from what I know right now, I think all of them have died over their exposure actually in South Africa, which makes sense. So, where did this come from? Jane and I were just talking about what a cool word we think epi. Now, how am I saying that wrong, Jane? Epi?
Epizootics.
Zootic. I keep wanting to call it zooic. But epizootics, what that means is epidemics associated with animals, zoo, okay? They think, and they're pretty sure, that bats are carriers of it. They don't get sick with it. It's just part of their normal. And then once those bats visit around gorillas and other monkeys, as well as doipers, cute little deer, these two animals become mixing bowls. So now they've taken the organism that wasn't pathogenic, expose it to the germs in these two animals, it mixes and changes and now becomes pathogenic to humans. So if you eat monkey or if you eat bats or eat this deer, which they do commonly in these countries, you will potentially be exposed to Ebola. So you were saying, why does it all of a sudden show up again? Somebody's eating some exposed meat in one community and it spreads. 80% of the outbreaks have been in areas where gorillas are common, where gorillas are around and people eat gorillas or eat other monkeys. So they think the gorilla is the mixing bowl. Remember when we had the pandemic influenza going around and we talked about how the bird was the colonizer and what was the mixer? Anybody remember?
Pig.
The pig. The pig. The pig was the mixing bowl. So the pig now would mutate the organism to make it pathogenic to humans. In this case, they think it's this deer and this and the gorillas. Make sense? Okay. So if you eat those meats, you're most likely going to be exposed to it. So I think we've heard on the news quite a little about the symptoms associated with this. Typically, we are looking, first of all, for the fever, but one thing that if you actually look into the illness as it evolves, one thing we haven't heard much about on television is the rashes that turn into boils that rupture and bleed. And that's where a lot of the hemorrhagic comes from. It's not so much, well, it is associated with bleeding from organs, especially the eyes, ears, and mouth, but also from all those boils that are all over their skin. So before this last outbreak, typically, if you went past this point, what they call the first stage, the odds are you weren't going to make it. Okay? Now we're seeing in the U.S. now, because of all the meds and the technology we have, where people are surviving into the second stage. But the second stage is when you actually have the hemorrhagic response. And when that happens, if you look back in the studies that were done in 1999, you almost always died once you got to this stage. So Mr. Duncan, by the time he got into the hospital, he was hemorrhagic. And so it was almost too late for him as well. So the transmission and shedding, we've also heard a lot about that. You know, at this point, we know you're not transmissible prior to symptoms. We know that all body fluids carry it. But we also have learned that your titer load, your amount of viron per drop, is pretty low up front in the illness. It's after they're guesstimating between 9 and 10 days post-op or post-onset that at that point, your viron load goes crazy. And so you have tons and tons of the virus in one drop of blood. I've read somewhere it's about 1,000 times more virus than what we see in a drop of blood. So it's very communicable. The body fluids at that point, it doesn't take much to be exposed. So someone who typically, for example, the patients that have gone to downtown to the biocontainment unit, their viral load probably never got to a point where it was as bad as Mr. Duncan's was in Dallas. So their transmissibility was even less at that point. typically, if you live past day 14, the odds are you're going to make it. Okay, and convalescence, you develop antibodies just like you do with any other virus, and you measure the viral load. So so as the disease progresses, you're more communicable. So, what have we learned so far? Every day, every hour, this changes. When Jane and I come to work every morning, the first thing we talk about is what we learned from CDC overnight, because it's changing.
So you're more communicable as it goes on. So when does it start going down? When do you start becoming not? I think that's the biggest question most people have as far as keeping people quarantined and whatnot, is like, when are we allowing people to get back into society? When are they no longer going to pass it on?
Typically, once you get past day 14 and you're still alive, your viral load naturally starts to decrease. So usually by, I think what they have found now with the meds that they're giving the patients and the antibodies from that first case patient, that 3 weeks after, they have no viral load. They're negative.
3 weeks after you start the hemorrhagic stage?
No, after you have your first symptoms.
3 weeks after your first
Yeah.
symptoms. So after
With the
fever?
treatments that patients under treatment, yeah. Once you start the fever, they get into a good place, get treated. Usually it takes 3 weeks before they get a negative out of the patient. And what they're looking for is 3 negative blood draws, and then they start developing antibodies, their own antibodies. We've been giving them passive antibodies from that case patient, which they're finding does make a big difference, which is logical from what we know of viruses. So the symptoms associated with this virus, other than the hemorrhagic, and the recovery is the same with any other virus. We can't treat the virus per se, we treat the symptoms. And one thing they learned from patient 1 to patient 2 up at the containment center was that they needed to do more lab testing, about 2-3 times a day. They were checking their indices to see how much they need to change their electrolytes or volume load or whatever to protect them and to ease the organ damage that potentially happens with these patients. So those 2 nurses that just came through, do you notice how quickly they were cured? Well, they're learning from the other patients on what to do. And they really, in one of them, they were negative in 2.5 weeks, I think. So we just have to help them get through that heavy viral load and survive and get past that point. Okay, so what have we learned so far and how does it affect us at NOH? First of all, we have learned that we have to screen patients up front. Dallas taught us that, right? So we have to ask the right questions. So what the CDC is asking us now is every first point of entry into a system, we need to ask these 3 questions. Have they been in one of these high-risk countries within the last 21 days? And have they been exposed to Ebola, known Ebola, or suspected Ebola patient? If you get a yes to any one of those 2, then you ask symptoms. You don't ask symptoms first.
On behalf of our patients.
Right, right. You'd have diarrhea, vomiting, fever after your patient's coming in. They can still come in with it as long as they're not from these countries and haven't been exposed. So we were just talking about how they're going to, for the sake of verbiage, they're going to combine in the computer the first 2 questions into one. And then if that one's positive, if you get a yes to either thing on that question, then you go to the next one. Okay? And we're going to do it with outpatient, inpatient, and so forth. You only have to ask once, though, the first point of entry. So, for example, in physical therapy, first time they come in, we will ask. After that, we ask, as we routinely do, have there been any changes? Now, if we were in an outbreak in the country, if the outbreak was actually happening here, we would be more aggressive. At that point, we would not only ask that, but we would be taking fevers, checking temps on every patient, every time. But we're not gonna get there. It would have to be a serious disaster for that to happen, I hope. So another lesson learned is that we need to share the information with the right people. We need to make sure that those who are concerned and monitoring this are aware. So nurses and doctors, anyone who would be caring for the patient needs to be made aware of their history. In our case, we are not going to let them pass go. We will not be caring for patients. I'll get into more of that later. We will be the first point of entry to question them. If there's a concern, then we will be shipping the patient. If somebody would walk in and answer yes to that first question and have symptoms, these are the people that need to be identified and made aware of it. Just this week, the public health let us know that there are now ambulances and teams on ambulances who are prepared to deal with Ebola patients. So when we transport a patient, we transport them through the health department. So we call the health department, let them know we have a suspected Ebola, and we contain the patient. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm sorry, and we call 911. I'm sorry, we call 911 and let them know, and then they will send a squad. We call the health department so that they can start contact tracing if necessary. And to also be aware, if they aren't aware already, that there's somebody in the states, in our state, that has transfer or that has come from the country of risk and or exposed. So those are two key contacts that we will need to make. At that point, we would assign a person to manage the activity associated with that patient. Dan, myself, Jane, and any of the charge nurses in ED would be the incident commander under Hicks, okay, to manage that patient. Then all activity needs to be documented and so forth. And the people in ED will be getting more and more education. It's just a case. So even if we never see an Ebola patient, this is a good practice for us in case some other creature shows up, that we might have to have a protocol in place. And now we've developed one and recognize what we need to do. So I just put this in here. There's tons and tons now of posters and flow sheets and so forth available from CDC. But I really like this one, and I think you guys have seen this one in ED, haven't you? But one of the things we recognized is that, for example, when we do get a potential patient, we need to limit our risk of exposure. And that means limiting any diagnostic testing, any limiting of any aerosol producing activity with that patient. So we will not do those here. We will ship the patient and let them, one of the other facilities, deal with it. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what we will do is we will isolate in room 2, right? Is that right? So a patient comes in, let's say, into ED, the questions turn out positive. The access person will contact the triage nurse with probably an oh dear in front of it, and then we will put a mask on the patient, hand hygiene the patient, and take them back to 2. Okay, if we have time, we take out everything out of 2 that we might not want to throw away. Because if this patient turns out to have Ebola, we're just going to throw everything away. Okay? Family and friends, anyone with that patient, we will also isolate. And we're going to use room 4 for that. So they would be put in, at that point, separated from their loved one and also from the public. We're going to use 3 for doffing, removing of equipment. SARS taught us the importance of that. If you remember back, when a patient from Europe went to a hospital in Canada, he showed up at the hospital with symptoms with his wife. They put him immediately into isolation and let the wife sit in the waiting room. she was also communicable. They didn't realize that. And by the time their event was over, a security guard, a nurse, and 2 other people died in the waiting room. So anyone who's been exposed to this patient needs to be quarantined as well. Okay? Any questions? Oh, the other thing is, let's say a patient walks into PT, or a patient walks into, up on the floor on day 2, now has a fever and, oh yeah, by the way, I did travel. At that point, then, we would isolate the patient, and we would call ED to respond with their trained people. So at that point, you guys would suit up, go up to the floor, and you would take the patient down to room 2 and figure out what we need to do next. Okay? Again, we're going to do that with Ortho West as well. We're not going to respond to any of the other clinics, just Ortho West because of our relationship with them. The other clinics are being told, and I went to each one of the clinics. The UNMC clinics have protocols from downtown, and the rest of them, they were made aware that they need to call 911, and they need to call the health department to isolate the patient. We will not respond to that. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so next lesson we learned is the importance of standardized training. Making sure everyone is doing the same thing, protecting themselves all the time. We have learned that not every hospital is prepared to deal with this. If that dude would have walked into our office, or our ED, we would have had issues as well. Dallas, unfortunately, was our case to teach us what we need to do right. We recognize that the risk of Ebola is not worth training everyone to care for a dying Ebola patient. But we do realize we have to screen, that patients could come into any healthcare facility anytime. So what the recommendations are as of today are that we would screen, isolate, and ship to the appropriate place. Now, in many states, they have identified response hospitals. You just saw that with the nurse coming back into New York. She went to Bellevue, which is one of the 10 hospitals in New York that has agreed to be the responder and actually take care of the patients. So far in Nebraska, we do not have response hospitals identified. When that squad comes, that specially prepared squad comes to our facility, we will handle it just like any other patient and send the patient either to the hospital they want to go to or to the closest hospital. All the hospitals in town now are preparing to care for at least the original screening. So then they would take the patient in, they would draw their blood, isolate them for 3 to 6 days until the blood results are back. And then if it's positive, then at that point we would, as of today, this is most likely changing, but as of today, we would call the feds and they would give us permission to send the patient to the biocontainment. So let's say Lakeside has a patient. Even the med center can't use the biocontainment unit for their screening. Now, there's a lot of discussion with that going on now, whether that is truly a federal containment unit or if we can actually use it for our screening purposes. So stay tuned. That still has not been finalized.
Peg, you want to mention something about the restroom? Because the Ebola patient, according to CDC, is supposed to be placed in a private
Yes.
room with a restroom, and our ED rooms do not have a restroom.
So we are going to make that whole hallway, we've got tape ready now to block off from 4 to 1 and the restroom crossed. Okay, so that the patient could use that restroom, the family members could use that restroom, but nobody else would use that hallway. Does that sound okay? That hallway then would be considered contaminated.
Yeah, that would be I think it's just a restroom, it doesn't have a shower in it.
It has a shower.
There's a shower. Isn't there a restroom next door to room 2?
The one next to 2 doesn't, the one
Mhm.
across from 2 does, but it's
Well, we
still
don't
gonna be-
want the patient to use the shower room. we want a patient to use just the restroom, and I thought there was one right next to
There are.
it.
There is.
But it's right next to.
There's one right across the hall, there's
There's
one right down.
two, yeah, so it'll be
Yeah.
right next to room 2, not the shower restroom.
But that one would still be considered contaminated, because that's gonna be in that hallway, right?
Right.
So,
But
is it just because we don't want them in the shower, so anything going through the system, blah, blah, blah?
Right.
But other than that, it's still gonna be considered contaminated, because it's in that hallway.
Well, and isn't that where you guys had decided to shower, employees would shower after they dock? Would be in that shower, or is there another?
There's no shower in this building that we can use in this building except in that shower
Mhm.
across the hall. There's no shower down in the locker room by outpatient surgery, to my knowledge.
Well, we'll work through that. The next plan, Jane and Dan are gonna do a dawn and doffing for us today, and then do serious one-on-one education with you guys in ED, where you will actually all be required to don and doff and assist each other. So this is just the preliminary, and if we decide that it's not working logistically, we can still change.
Yeah.
Okay? Good questions. So 911 to get the specialized squad. Okay, the other thing we're still learning is monitoring and quarantine. As of 10 o'clock this morning, now when you travel from another country and you have been exposed, not ill, then you will be put into quarantine. Do you all know the difference between isolation and quarantine? Isolation is where we isolate you because you're sick, you're contagious. Quarantine is when you've been exposed and you're at this point not sick, but you have the risk of developing the illness. So in this case, quarantine would be potentially for 21 days from the entry of the country. As soon as you're sick, then we will isolate you. You're out of quarantine, you're into isolation. So this morning, the new regulations from CDC are that when someone comes back from Liberia, especially healthcare workers, military, or someone who's traveling from Liberia, then they would be quarantined per se for up to 21 days. That quarantine can be individualized in every state, but it must contain directed temperature monitoring twice a day. So that means public health is going to go to the home now. It's not self-reporting anymore. That public health will go to the home and take the temp. Now, another thing to remember at this point, when we're looking at federal agencies, to recognize that CDC is one of the few, if not the only one, of a federal agency that does not set laws. They're not a federal law agency. You can't go to jail for not following CDC. They are guidelines. They set guidelines. And every state, every public health then takes CDC's guidelines and incorporates them into their protocols. So part of the issues we've had, especially in Dallas, was that CDC was guiding them, but they have to accept CDC. CDC can't come right into your facility without permission from the local health department and you. So every state now can decide how they want to set their quarantine. And so hopefully most will use public health and CDC guidelines, let the person go to their own home, get them off of mass transit, and do directed temp monitoring. Pretty logical, right? We'll see how it goes.
So while they're at home and they're getting their temperature monitored twice a day, they're still possibly exposing everybody in that household that goes in and out, right?
Well, again, each state is different, but they're limiting people living with the person as well. So as soon as there is any indication of risk, temperature, then the other people get out. So if they're
It's all
not,
temperature based.
it's all temperature based. The first symptom to indicate infectability is temp. So it's okay for the people to live with you, until you have a temp.
I see. And then, let's say I develop a temperature, then I get isolated, that's the next step, right? Is there a law that legally says I have to be isolated?
At that point,
Or I have a right to say, no, I'm not gonna stay here, I wanna be in my own home?
At that point, your local state laws would take over, and you become a public health nuisance, and they can legally isolate you.
I see, okay.
I know that both Douglas County and Sorby County Health Departments are now reviewing their quarantine and isolation regulations. So they'll be prepared to enforce them if they have to.
Good point. Good point. As soon as that temp is up. Now, also remember, your titer load at that point is very low. So even your risk of communicability to your family is very low. So, you know, if I was coming back from Liberia and I was living with my family and I was at risk for 21 days, I'd be careful how much shedding and spreading I would do. And that's part of the education we need to give to the people at that point. And think about Mr. Duncan in Dallas. He lived with his girlfriend and family for a very long time, at least in Ebola time, and was at that point, no one got it. And most likely because A, his viral load was low, and B, he figured out that maybe you guys should stay away from my body. Okay? So the risk there was low. Once he got into the hospital, got into stage 2, we have a different story. Okay, I recently was lucky enough to fly through JFK actually last week, and had time between my flight to walk over to the International to see what was going on. I had to do that. And these posters were everywhere. I didn't see anybody in zoot suits, but they were making sure every international traveler was aware of our protocols. Okay, another lesson we've learned is that anything that is potentially contaminated by the patient now becomes trash, becomes waste, unless we have an effective way of cleaning it. So one of the things we've learned, and we talked about earlier, if you guys do an ED, have time to take out of the room whatever you can, that'd be great. Because once we have a patient in that room, anything that's been in that room, including any of your donning and doffing, will be kept in that room until we get a report back from the health department telling us the patient is either negative or positive. If the patient is negative, then we can trash it as we need to trash. If the patient's positive, then it becomes a Class A trash. At that point, we'll need to call Stericycle and get Class A containers. And anything that has been contaminated or involved with that patient would have to be put into those. And they're managed by Stericycle a little different than the rest of the trash. We are going to use the Oakview Biohazard Room as our staging area for green trash. So all other red bag trash now, when that happens, will have to be brought over to the dock.
And that would go for the other offices too then, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Have you told them?
Mm-hmm. They got a short list.
Okay.
Very short, but that was on there.
So is there a sign inside of that door?
Yes, it will say Class A, yellow tape, stay out. Stericycle will pick up very soon. Should be less than a day for us to have to store. And, you know, that, yeah. Right now, the way the outbreak is going down, that's what it would be. If, you know, it gets more serious, then we'll need to look at it again. But that's our protocol right now. Any questions about that? Okay, any other questions? Now we're gonna have Jane and Dan do a little bit of donning and doffing, but I just wanted to end with this. If you Google this morning, You're looking up something, this is the picture you see. I thought it was ironic. Today is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Dr. Salk. And I remember getting those polio sugar cubes as a kid. And by I think it was 1999, polio was eliminated from the United States. So we can do the same with Ebola. It's got to be done, okay? Recognize also that all outbreaks either start and stop in hospitals, in healthcare. Start and stop here. So we can change this. Amen.